Sup motherfuckers, right now how our project is set up, we can enter a command from the command line and call some sort of function based on the command. For example, the user types in no clip, then they'll be able to fly around without collision detection. One issue that was also solved, before getting to the bind key section of the video, was the tilde key being input upon pressing the command line key. All we need to do is to clear the command line text if the visibility of the command line is changed. So in both the if and else if statements shown in the input function here. Will just call clear text in case we ever want to add something else to the clearing. But for now, the command line is correctly cleared, although we can still see the tilde character for a split second, as you can see here. But at least it will not affect user input. Here is the clear text function in case you wanted to see it. It's just a line edit ref, and then we just set the text to nothing. The line edit ref just references this line edit right here. Now we're going to add two elements to the command zenum, bind and unbind. Bind will take a character that the user enters into the command line and link it to a command, or whatever string is attached that the user enters. The character will determine what key is linked to that command, and will parse whatever string is attached to that key whenever the user presses that key. So it'll be as if they enter that command every time they press the key. Unbind does the opposite of bind, and instead clears the key from being associated with the command that we attach to the key. To convert characters to scan codes, we're going to create a constant dictionary called keybinds symbols that has a single character strings as keys and their corresponding scan codes as values. This took a bit to type, so I copied it from my notes. All these keys are only corresponding to the symbol keys on the keyboard, as alphanumeric keys are much easier to translate. That means that like pressing A or Z is much easier to translate to a scan code than pressing like something like apostrophe or period. That'd be much harder to take from a character and convert it to a scan code. So that's why we have this dictionary. Right now, this dictionary is still not being used, but it is going to be used in the bind and unbind functions later to make sure all the symbol keys are accounted for on the keyboard. The run command function needs to be changed to take in command codes. This is because we're going to use the command zenum for the match statements instead of strings. So we'll have something like commands.item and then call a function based on the command code passed into the function. So here I'm adding a parameter called command code, and we're going to pass that in and replace the commands.toLower with command code. So instead of these strings, we're going to use the commands enum values for the match statements, and we're going to add the bind and unbind enum values and then call their respective functions based on the match statements for this function. So right now I'll just put pass for the bind and unbind values, but later on we'll call the functions with them. Now the run command function will give us an error above in the parsing function, since we're going to need to pass in an integer. To pass in the correct integer every time, we're going to make a decoding function called getCommandCode that takes in a string and outputs the correct command code. So this will be another match statement store function that takes in strings like run command used to, but will not actually perform any of the function calling. The nice part about splitting up functionality this way is that with getCommandCode, we can verify if the command string passed in is valid. If we have hit a correct command string, what we're going to do is we're going to return the correct command code. Otherwise, we'll just return -1, and that will be our verification, because we'll have something above 0 if it's correct, or -1. And run command only runs commands now if we pass in the correct command code. So this can make our program much more flexible, which will come in handy for when we're ready to code the key binding steps. When you make a major change like this, it's always a good idea just to test it out the game real quick. So let's test out enemy alien, boom, spawned, it's all good. Moving on to the binding functionality, we're going to start by making the bind command function. And it will take in a value that we'll call key2command that's of type string. First off, we're going to get the character of the string that was passed into the function, which is the first character I mean. This function will assume that we have already split off the rest of the string from the command itself. So the command called bind and the spaces afterwards will already be stripped off by this point. We now know that at least one character followed by some string afterwards will be passed to this function. So we're going to grab the first character with the substring function that's built into Godot and give it to a variable of type string by passing in the parameters 0 and 1 to the substring function. 0 means that we're starting at index 0 and then moving forward one character. So we're grabbing that character at index 0 and giving it to that variable that we created. After this step, we're going to retrieve the correct scan code using os.findscanCode from string, which is built into Godot. If this doesn't work, then we'll rely on the keybinds symbols dictionary that we created earlier in this video. If the scan code we received from the os.find scan code from string is 0, then that function was unable to find the scan code associated with the character that we entered. So if the scan code is 0 at this point, that means that we didn't get valid scan code, and we're going to check the keybind symbols dictionary. So if it has that string, our local variable will now contain a valid scan code. We'll use the get function from that dictionary to get the correct scan code after we've already checked the has function. Else we'll return out of the function and tell the player that the key is invalid. If the key should be valid but it was marked as invalid, then we'll need to change the dictionary and add a new symbol. Otherwise, we've now had enough checks to make sure that the scan code is actually indeed valid. Holy shit, that's a mo-fucking word salad. We're now going to check if there's at least one space between the character entered and the command, since we only want single characters to be bound to the keys. We'll do this by using the substring function again and passing in 1 and 1. Of course, this may not be necessary if you want to get characters such as escape, or sequences of characters such as escape, but in this implementation we're only accepting single characters as keys, so if there's not at least one single space afterwards, then we'll return out of the function. After this, the rest of the string will be the argument we are trying to save, so something like enemy alien, as typed in the string at the top of this function. We will do this by calling substring again and passing in 2 by itself. This means that we'll get everything from index 2 and onwards from the string. After grabbing that, we're going to strip the string of any parentheses. We are also going to strip of any spaces that we find. While I don't show in this video, you should strip the right side of the string as well to make sure that only the argument is being bound to that key. Stripping the double quotes is only for if the user wanted to use quotations when entering the argument that they are binding to the key. So we strip them to make sure that it's valid for our parsing function. Now we'll find the index of the next space. By finding that index, we'll also find the length of the command substring that comes after the character for the key we're trying to bind. We'll use the string's find function, and wherever that space's index is, we'll return to an int called argSpaceIndex. We'll then check if the substring is valid by passing the command string into getCommandCode and checking if that function returns -1. To pass that in, first we're going to isolate the command substring, and then by using arg.substring, and then go from 0 to argSpaceIndex. Now that we have the command substring isolated, we'll pass command into getCommandCode, and then set it to equals to -1. If this ends up being true, then we're just going to return out of the function and print out an error message. It's probably a really good idea to print out an error message to let the player know that they typed in something wrong. Here's the error message I'm using. To enable these bound keys for the session, to send command line arguments when pressing a key, we're going to create a variable called keybinds and make it a dictionary. This will be a dynamic dictionary that will grow during the session when the user enters keybind commands and shrink when the user enters unbind commands. This will be the dictionary that we will use to actually deliver these commands or arguments when the user presses a key that they have bound to some sort of action. At the end of the bind command function, we're going to create a new key for the keybinds dictionary and assign that key a value. The key will be the scan code, and the value will be the argument that the player entered to be assigned to a key. Note that this scan code and value are only saved for the session, so when the player exits the game, all the keys that they have bound to the action arguments will be lost. Now that we are able to add bound keys to a dictionary, we want to be able to run the action that is bound within the input function, because that's where we'll be pressing the actual key. So we want to run it in here. First, we're going to check if the event is an input key, right here, and this will be after all the command line stuff is done. So we just want to make sure if they select the command line button, all we'll do is close down and that's it. Otherwise, if it's an input key that's been bound to something, then we want to check all this. And I'll go over all these in a second. But right now, we just want to check if it's an input key. So if we only check if it's an input key, it'll go through the keybinds dictionary, check if we have the scan code, and if it has a scan code, we're going to get the value or the action that's bound to that key and run it through the parse input text function right here. That's why we split up the functionality between online edit text entered and parse input text. So that way we could run them separately. So that way if we want to run some extra stuff, if the user's typing stuff in, we could do it in this function. Else, if we just only want to parse the input text, we could just use this function. So let's get back to this. So we get the keybinds, we get the scan code, we search for the scan code within the keybinds, and then we return the action and parse through that text and then run it like we would as if we typed down the command line. That's what's happening here. The only problem is if we just do it like this, it's going to run many times for that single key press. Now, here's the reason. When holding down a key, a continuous amount of signals will be sent from a key on the keyboard to the OS for as long as the key is held down. On top of that, these signals are sent quite fast, at least relatively to us. So even if it seems like we're just pressing a key, interrupt signals could be sent many times during what seems like a single key press. So a bunch of signals could be sent, like 4 or 5, however many. This means that when we press one of our bound keys, we may run that specific action we have bound multiple times from a single key press when it should only be run once. We only want this to be run once per key press, but this isn't enough to do it. So what we might want to do to combat this is we want to make an integer that tracks the last key that was pressed by getting the scan code. That's what we're doing right here with the last key. And we define this up here, var last key of type int is equal to -1. Ignore this stuff as I'll go over it later in the video. Right now I really want to go over this. So here's the last key. We get the event scan code because we've pressed it. And next time we want to run this, we're going to check if that scan code is less than 0. Because by default, we're going to set this variable to -1. Otherwise, you'll have a scan code while we're pressing a bound key. And that's what this check does after that. So what this check is doing, we're checking if the last key is greater than or equal to 0. If it's greater than or equal to 0, that means that we have previously pressed a bound key, and we're going to check if it's still being pressed. If it is still being pressed, then this isn't going to run. We're not going to run this, and we're not going to run this. Now, if we let go of it, that means the user has let go, and then we set the last key to -1. So when we come back here, if the user presses the same one or any other bound key again, then we're going to this will be true, and we'll be able to run the parse input text again and run our command. And also on top of that, we're only running when the command line is visible or active, because that's the only time we really want to run it. We don't want to run bound keys while we're trying to type in commands. So if the user wants to type in a command, we won't run bound keys at all. But that's what this last key is doing right here. This is a big piece of this puzzle. Because like we get the last key, we check if it's -1, then we give it the scan code, and if it's something else besides -1, then we cannot run this again. So we only run it once, and we ignore all the future signals that are being sent. So that's how you only run once per key press. So now we're just going to go to the run command function, and then just call bind command in the commands.bind statement, and then just pass in value, and that will bind commands for us. Let's do bind k enemy alien. Let's just check. So as you can see, it's actually doing it. So let's do bind v no clip. So now I could actually go into no clip just by pressing V instead of having to type it out every time. And yeah, so now we're able to bind any key to that. And let's test one of the simple keys. So let's do bind fly. Whoops. I think that actually worked. Let me see. Let me get out of this mess. Yeah, now that actually did work. I can still collide with stuff while flying, so that means that the fly command worked. And if I go into one of the aliens, they still hurt me. Yeah, so I could just fly around now. Now we want these bindings to be saved across play sessions. As of now, if we close the game, those bindings that the player entered will be lost, and the player will have to enter them again on the next session. To save these bindings, the easiest way with our implementation is to use config files. Config files are perfect for dictionaries as it can contain sections, keys, and values. Keys are on the left side of the equal sign, and values are in quotes on the right side of the equal sign here. The sections contain many keys and values and could pretty much be used for different dictionaries or whatever you want. To make these config files, we're going to make a variable in Godot called config that is of type config file. This will allow us to save our keybinds dictionary in a section of our choosing. First though, it's a good idea to specify the path you want to save the config file to. We're not going to use the res folder for saving. Instead, we're going to use the user folder. So we're going to make a path that's in the user folder. We'll choose the user folder and save it as keybinds.cfg and call our section name bound keys. And we're going to call these variable names user keybinds path, user keybinds name, and user keybinds section name. At the end of the bind command function, we're going to call config.setValue to save a key and value to the section. We'll pass in user keybind section name, our scan code converted into a string from an int, and our argument that we're trying to bind to a key. After that, we'll call config.save and pass the full path to our config file. Here we do that using user keybinds path plus user keybinds name plus a string of .cfg. This will correctly add a new key and value to that file. If a key and value already exists in the section that we're saving to, then that bound key will be overridden. Bind k enemy alien. Let's see how it does that. So it's still working. Let's get out of the game. Let's see if it got loaded. So now we want to reload it, and now it's actually been bound to the enemy alien. So now we have bound keys right here, and we have our scan code, and this is our argument that we saved. So this is a K scan code, and we've saved enemy alien right here. So I hope this helps it click together that we're actually saving an integer that contains a string basically. To load the saved bound keys, we're going to make a function called load keybinds. In the first part of the function, we're going to use the config file's load function with our full path to the config file and check if the status returned is okay. If it's not, then we'll return out of the function. Whether or not you want to print out an error is up to you though, because this may or may not be seen as an error the first time the player boots up the game, as a config file may not be created yet. Here though, for debugging purposes, I will print out an error. Now we're going to check if the section we're looking for actually exists. If it does not exist, then this is probably an error, so we'll return out of the function. If all else is good, then we'll get the section keys from the config file and give it to a variable called section keys. We'll pass in the user keybind section name to get all the keys as a pool string array. We'll then iterate through all the variables keys and check if the keys are valid integers since they're supposed to be scan codes. Even if we know the key is a valid integer though, it is still a string, so we need to convert it to an int and then create a new key for the keybinds dictionary, which will start off as empty and will be populated with all these keys and values. To get the values from the config file section, we'll use config.getValue and pass in the user keybind section name and a key as arguments. We'll then give the return of that to our dictionary. We want to print an error if the keys are not valid integers, since this whole process relies on the keys being scan codes. So let's go through this. Let's go through bind k and enemy alien, and then bind v no clip. Let's get out. Let's check if this has been edited. It has. Now we have these two. Let's check if it's been loaded up the next time. So if it's been loaded up correctly, we should be able to float through the air. It has not been loaded correctly. So for some reason something happened because we're not calling the function because I'm an idiot. Load keybinds. Let's check it. So now it's correctly loading the thing. We can now spawn mo-fucking aliens everywhere. And boom. So now we're actually outside the map and they're all chasing us. And those motherfuckers are below us are trying to like chase me. Because they can see through motherfucking walls. Okay. And yeah, so now we have all the loading done and the saving done. So now actually we're already pretty much done. But the only problem is now we can't unbind those keys. So if we want to unbind the keys, we're going to have to actually go into this motherfucking text file and take out these keybinds. And that's going to be a motherfucking pain in the motherfucking ass. So we have this unbind command function. Before I start, let's make sure I actually called this function so I don't think I'm doing something wrong. Boom, right there. And we have unbind command. So right now, let's get rid of this string right here because it's useless now. But let's just keep this in mind. This is the thing that we're going to have. We're going to have unbind and then k. So that's what it's going to check. In our unbind command function, we'll first check if the bound key, which is the string passed in the function, is of length 1. If it's not of length 1, then we'll print an error and return out of the function. Next, we'll find the scan code the same way we found in the bind command function. So what I meant by the scan code stuff is we're first going to get the scan code, which is of type int, and get the scan code from string from using the bound key. And then we're going to check if the scan code's 0, else we're going to use this dedicated function that I have just for getting symbol scan codes and by passing the bound key. So to get the scan codes, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make an integer and get the function the same way we got in the bind command function. And we'll use a find scan code from string, pass in the bound key. And if that's 0, then we'll get the symbol scan code using this function the same way in both the bind command function and that one. And this way we don't have to rewrite everything. We could just use the same logic right here. Just boom, boom, and then call that. And then boom, boom, and call that. And what this function is doing is basically pass in a key to bind, which is a string, and it returns an int. And so we get the scan code, which is of type int, set to 0 at first. And if the keybind symbols has that key to bind, then we'll set the scan code to something else, will return 0. And yeah, so no matter what, it will return 0 or something else. And if it's 0 again, then that's something went wrong. And we're going to probably want to check if this scan code is actually 0 as well. So we do want to check if what we entered is valid. Code is still equal to 0. Then return out of the function and print some sort of error message. Invalid key. So invalid key. And yeah, and this will keep it like kind of simple, so that way we don't have to rewrite everything. And we're going to check if keybinds has scan code, and then we'll just say cannot unbind bound key. I think the reason why I did this is because keybinds will never have a scan code of 0, but I think this is a good way to do it, because if the scan code is equal to 0, that means we have an invalid key. Otherwise, yeah. But I think this is good to have 2 error checks like this. And then afterwards, like after we're done checking if the keybinds has that scan code, we'll print an error message if it doesn't. Otherwise, we're going to actually erase that scan code from the keybinds dictionary. And the config file, which is very nice, has a function called erase section key. And all we got to do is just pass in the user keybinds section name and pass in the string version of the scan code, and then pass it into that function, and then it'll erase that section, that key and value for us from the file. And it does it without deleting all the other ones. It'll just delete this one key and this one value. And then after that, we save to make sure that the results stick between sessions, and just like we would with the bind thing. So we only ever save if we're binding a key or unbinding a key. Now, what would be a bad idea actually is what you could actually do with this. You can actually bind a bind command to a bind, or bind an unbind command to that, and then you could just keep unbinding keys left and right. I don't know why you do that, but it's possible. But that's up to the user. I think we'll need to check for that, and I think this is all fine. No clip, because I like no clip better. And boom. Yeah. Okay, let's check if it got saved correctly. It's now 39 equals to no clip. Let's go into this. Unbind. Okay, that key's not working. And we got rid of it. So everything is working mo-fucking good. So that's about it. This is how you, This is how you save your mo-fucking keys to mo-fucking commands and for a command line, so that way every time you don't have to type in the whole mo-fucking command. So this helped. Hope you all have a wonderful mo-fucking day. Peace.